I'm Julia Stash. I'm president of the MacArthur Foundation, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight for what I know will be a fascinating conversation about the important role that public and independent media play in fostering a more informed electorate and shaping a more inclusive public discourse. But I'm also pleased to welcome you because I have news to share about MacArthur's renewed and expanded commitment to independent journalism and media. At MacArthur, we spend a lot of time thinking about shared social goals and the public good. We struggle to figure out what we should do to make the greatest possible difference. So in search of more positive change and deeper impact, we're making just a few of what we call big bets that real progress can be made on profound, even existential challenges like climate change or nuclear risk or mass incarceration in the US. But we know that progress is not possible without people in this country who are informed, empathetic, activated, and thinking critically. So to help make that happen, we've supported forward-looking nonprofit media for 33 years. And along the way, we have regularly updated our approach to take into consideration changes in the media environment and changes in technology. But one thing has not changed, and that is our commitment to independent inquiry and authentic storytelling, truth-telling, and provocation. So today, we are affirming what we call our enduring commitment to independent and nonprofit journalism and media, to explanatory and investigative journalism and documentary storytelling at its best. But in a new direction, we are adding support for the field of civic or citizen media that is often the most purely public of all media forms. Now, of course, much is said and written about young people and their use of social media. We want to support and accelerate their use of media for civic purposes. So our goals are to strengthen and diversify the independent media ecosystem that fuels public awareness and drives and informs conversations across the country. We want to make sure that an ever-widening array of voices and perspectives finds its way into virtually every medium. We want to promote traditional and new forms of nonfiction storytelling by individuals, groups, and professionals. And we want to help makers, producers, and others find fresh ways of reaching audiences wherever those audiences are. Excuse me. So 5-year, completely unrestricted general operating grants are one of our tools for investing in groundbreaking nonprofit news organizations. So as part of our larger commitment, a dozen nonprofit news organizations will receive a total of $25 million in general operating support grants designed first and foremost to foster editorial independence and innovation. Thank you. Now, indeed, unrestricted operating support is a cornerstone of our approach and often distinguishes us from others in the field today. The no-strings certainty of funding helps creative leaders like many of you in the room build human capital and take calculated risks on coverage and innovative approaches to audiences. This is our enduring commitment to journalism and media. It takes its place alongside our enduring commitment to Chicago, our headquarters and our hometown. Here in Chicago, we have invested more than $1.1 billion here, most of it benefiting the city's low-income communities and their residents. Here are just a few examples. Multi-million-dollar direct grants to the Safer Foundation for a prisoner reentry demonstration program in Garfield Park. A grant to the University of Chicago, which houses the Black Youth Project. An impact investment to Self-Help Ventures, which turned the failed Second Federal Savings in Pilsen into a local credit union and helped 1,000 families keep their homes. An impact investment in Chicago Community Loan Fund, which provided financing from its pool to Trinity United Church of Christ Development Arm for Imani Village, affordable housing, health center, and an urban farm in Chicago's South Side, and many, many more. So like that work here in Chicago, it's important for us to bring the journalism work to ground here in Chicago like never before. So we fund public media and filmmakers. We're building a portfolio of organizations that help young people with a focus on young people of color, transfer their digital experiences into influence in the political realm. And we're looking to help strengthen local accountability and investigative reporting. Now, all of this exciting work is led by the director of our journalism and media program, Cathy M. Cathy, please come up here and introduce our speakers and get this important conversation started. Thank you very much, and welcome to the evening.
Thank you, Julie. I, along with my journalism and media colleagues, Lauren Pabst and Jen Humke, are very pleased to bring to you our hometown audience an all-star panel representing the most exciting aspects of our program, and some of these individuals who we at MacArthur view as the visionary leaders of independent media and journalism. So I will introduce them and bring them out for you. First, we have Raney Aronson of executive producer of PBS Frontline. Cathy Cohen, chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago and founder of Black Youth Project. Tabitha Jackson, director of the Sundance documentary film program. Mary Stucky, founder and executive director of Round Earth Media. And last but certainly not least, Sreenivasan, anchor of PBS NewsHour.
Thank you very much to the MacArthur Foundation for having us. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right then. You know, walking out here, I just realized I should point out this exception, though it shouldn't be so exceptional. But there's a slight gender imbalance in this panel. I don't know what the hashtag is, strong women or what, but this is fantastic, right? I mean, this is one of those things. I get onto panels all the time, and it is very refreshing to not be the only person of color, but also to be outnumbered. Well, I mean, I also, in public media and at the NewsHour and at PBS, for example, I'm relatively used to this. I have 3 bosses, an executive producer, and the co-anchors of the weekday program, all women. Their boss that heads news and public affairs at PBS, a woman. The head of PBS, a woman. The head of Corporation of Public Broadcasting, a woman. You see a pattern, right? And we're doing some... But I just wanted to start this conversation with just a couple of thoughts for you and why it's so important to make this kind of commitment to journalism today. I've said before that opinions are cheap, facts are expensive. And it's a relatively simple idea. And in this era, you could say tweets are cheap and facts are expensive, however you want to modify that, right? But if time is money, it takes both of those things to do the kind of work that is represented on this stage. And let me try and give you just a little bit of an introduction to our guests on that. Mary Stucky's here from Round Earth Media. We'll talk a little bit more about the model that she works with. But when she does films about Hondurans fleeing the country, it's not just the scenes that we see at the border. And that's really what kind of filters through to us on commercial media, on your local newscast at night. It's a little bit more of the making sense of it, the why. And was it 2015 you got the Peabody Award for that, right?
2014.
2014?
Received in 2015, you know how that works.
Right. And that was a collaboration with Latino USA, Planet Money, and NPR's All Things Considered. And there's also a pattern in this collaboration. Is that when Raney Aronson did the film Rape in the Fields, I don't know if you saw that or not, it was really powerful television. Yeah, sure. It won a DuPont Award, an RFK Award, but about how female farm workers fall prey to their bosses. And then there was a follow-up, Rape on the Night Shift, about custodial workers in the United States, which also won a lot of awards. And that was a collaboration as well with Univision, the Center for Investigative Reporting, UC Berkeley. I know Lowell's here, giving you a shout out. And again, those collaborations, again, it's because this isn't inexpensive work. That, commercial television, I've worked at ABC, I've worked at CBS. These are huge, august institutions that have hundreds of journalists working all over the world. they could certainly commit to this, right? But it's really, really expensive, the amount of time and energy it takes for reporters to chase down these stories and sometimes run into dead ends and then come back to the boss and say, well, this part didn't work out. Well, how do we adjust, right? That's just not something that somebody who's trying to get the newscast on at 5 o'clock has the patience for. So it's an incredibly expensive process. Tabitha Jackson's here. From the Sundance Documentary Fund, Invisible War, you've probably seen that or you've heard that. Maybe you watched it on PBS. You know, besides all the, I think, were you nominated for an Oscar for that, right?
I wasn't, unfortunately, but the filmmakers were.
Yes, the filmmakers were for a documentary. But besides the sort of award level impact, let's just think about the fact that right now that film is actually being used as part of the training about sexual assault in the military in parts of the Air Force and the Army. I mean, that is an enormous impact, not just to raise awareness, but possibly change a culture over a period of a generation. And it's not just to support the creators that already exist, I think, but it's also important for this kind of funding to create another generation of storytellers. And we've got Cathy Cohen of Black Youth Project on stage here. She's going to be telling us a little bit about the Next Generation Survey and about, frankly, about how we actually don't know how young minorities, young blacks, and young Hispanics think about things. We kind of make it up as we go along because there aren't any good hard numbers. But the way she's approaching it, besides the survey, what the Black Youth Project also does is it creates an opportunity for these young storytellers to come out, and the idea that they are empowered to tell their story, the stories of their peers, and in fact, it actually has a long-term impact on their lives. When you look back at one of the original videos that they did 6 or 7 years ago, and I was asking her earlier about where are they now, and one of them is running for Congress, one of them is else. I mean, it's part of, yeah. I mean, the idea that they feel like they're not just a statistic. They're not going to be mistaken for either, you know, oh, look, isn't this great that this person came from the south side of Chicago and they're now going to Harvard. They're one of those really amazing superstar young African Americans. Or, well, isn't it amazing that you didn't end up in prison, right? Well, there's just a huge gap that we're missing about all these different stories that make us all Americans. There are young Latinos and young African Americans and young Jewish kids and young Irish kids all growing up in a multitude of different ways, whether they're going to malls, whether they're watching documentaries, whether they're living on farms, right? There are these different stories that we sometimes forget when we get to the shorthand that we kind of live with out of convenience. So let me start the conversation. First, Raney, we were having kind of an interesting conversation that will stay off the record. But I think what's interesting is how you're adapting to this new era where Frontline has traditionally been, I mean, you actually use the term film. They don't just make hour-long TV, they make films. And David Fanning used to say films all the time. I hear you say films all the time. But what's also interesting is you also, I guess, make Facebook films now, right? So how you're adapting to...
I think we mean story. We can say
it could be stories.
We mean story, and
yeah.
we use film and documentary in those words, and we think, you know,
absolutely.
It's journalistic documentary.
Yeah, and you're figuring out ways to be adapt into these different platforms. How are you doing it? Why are you doing it?
I mean, I think our biggest purpose right now is to make sure we're reaching new people and new audiences and a new generation of people who we hope will then come under the tent of Frontline in a multitude of different ways. And we believe that we have to go where they are. A lot of people and new generations are not finding us on pbs.org or on television. And we all know this in this room, that we need to actually go to platforms where they're engaged with their friends and with their own communities. And we need to say to them, this is what we're doing, this is who we are, come and taste the work that we're doing. We hope that we will bring you back to us at pbs.org or Frontline's longer films, and we hope that you'll engage in that. But we also believe that if you don't come right away, we might find you another time. So we're going there because we care about reaching new people. And we have to, frankly, at each and every one of us, not just for our audience metric or the return on investment or all the words you hear, but because public media needs to reach new people, and we need to be actively passionate about that. And we need to be humbled by the fact that they're not always coming to us and we can go to them.
So how do your filmmakers, Tabitha, deal with this too? I mean, this is some of them are coming at this from a generational shift where maybe while they're making a long-form film, they're thinking about storytelling in a different way right now.
And I think that's why it's a bit of a cliche, but we do talk about a golden age of documentary, partly for that reason, that when these huge acts of passion and commitment and invocation of huge debt in these feature-length films are taking place, now filmmakers have the opportunity to make short-form work. They can make a New York Times op docs, or they can do something for The Guardian, or for any of these platforms, to keep themselves busy, creative, to keep reflecting the world, to keep that communication with an audience. And so there are lots of different ways. And now, the audience has their own audience, that even talking about audiences and viewers feels slightly odd. People are participants and they're making their own stuff. So as well as short form, and we at the documentary film program have just moved into short form with the support of Cathy and MacArthur, as well as short form, there are these new representational technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality. Is that going to be another method through which our storytellers, filmmakers, artists, whatever we call them, can do their work? And we're at a very exciting experimental stage in that.
It seems that there's a shift. Closer. It seems that there's also a shift in how we perceive what we formerly considered the audience, right? That it used to be that we would try to take something, put it on film or put it on television, then put that on social media as a distribution platform. It seems like there's now a change in perhaps how a filmmaker sees sourcing material in that social media space and starting to try and create something. Some of the stuff that your young students are working on, they see sources in places that even when we were kind of coming through this, we didn't automatically assume, wow, that's something I can use in a long-form doc or a story.
Right. I mean, I think Tabitha hit on something that's critically important here, which is the participatory nature of this new generation, right? So when we talk about audience, it isn't clear who the audience is. And in fact, the positionality of being audience member and creator changes all the time, and it's fabulous, right? The other piece I think that we want to pay attention to is, if we are even thinking of an audience, the composition and demographics of that audience is changing dramatically, right? And so there needs to be kind of multiple sources and multiple platforms that are at times culturally specific, that talk to the different components of this thing we call an audience now, and also to producers. So at the Black Youth Project, what we're trying to do is to say, in fact, that we want to kind of highlight and amplify the voices of young, in particular African Americans, but young kids of color, because there's a demographic shift that suggests not only are they not going to be on the margin, but they're going to be on the center and defining, in fact, culture, as they always do, but also what constitutes news and mobilization. But the other thing that we're trying to do is, and I'll be quick, the other thing we're trying to do is not just amplify voice, but to remember the ways in which we can connect voice, or they can connect voice to influence. And sometimes that happens in the political realm, but there are other sites of power where that also happens, and sometimes they target Hollywood, and sometimes they target Wall Street, and sometimes they think about culture, right? So part of what we're also trying to do is create a space where, in fact, we can follow the lead of young people who increasingly blur this kind of boundary between the political and the popular, to create and innovate in ways that kind of, I don't think we've seen before, and is a really exciting moment, I think, for all of us.
So tell us a bit, just a sliver about the survey and the idea that you started mentioning this, and I just want to follow up on that.
Sure.
What do we know about what young people think today, and what are you hoping to fix in that equation?
What do we know about what they think today? Is this my? I'll take over for the next hour and tell you what young people think today. It's more that what we don't know systematically about what young people think today. And what we were talking about backstage is that quite often individuals are comfortable interviewing one or two young people, and you write a story, or you make a documentary, or you report it, and that becomes the truth. And in particular, we seem comfortable with that when dealing and thinking about young people of color. The argument has been, and I agree with this, that increasingly the ways in which the public becomes visible today is not only through the ways in which we go and vote, but also the ways in which we register our opinions. It's hard to turn on, for this crowd, I'll say Morning Joe, and not see them talking about a poll about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. But often left out of that conversation, often left out of the process of polling and surveying, is taking young people seriously. So we are building a panel with the support of the MacArthur Foundation and Cathy M. and Jen and Lauren, where we will be able to survey young people with an oversample of African Americans and Latinos in particular, but also Asian Americans, every month. So that when Michael Brown, when the next, I hate to say it, when the next Michael Brown is killed, we'll be able to go into the field and actually have concrete data on how young people, and in particular young people of color, are responding to that issue. And when we think about the fact that we've seen this massive mobilization in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, but very little real data on how young people think about this, it is a travesty in terms of taking them seriously and taking our political system and our political change seriously. So we're trying to rectify that, and a lot of that is happening because of the support of MacArthur.
Mary, I don't know if everybody in the audience knows how Round Earth Media works. If you can just kind of explain the model a little bit.
Okay, so we cover the world outside U.S. borders. And we do this with journalists under the age of 35. I think everyone here probably understands what's happened to journalism, the disruption that the internet has caused. When I came to Minneapolis as a cub reporter in the late 1970s, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune had 5 foreign bureaus just for that single paper. Today, there are none. This at a time when the world is more interconnected than ever, and when we have really great journalists, and I mean bicultural journalists, journalists who speak many languages. How are we going to cover the world today at a time of dwindling resources, at a time when, in the old days, a foreign correspondent could parachute in to a country with a big bag of money and hire a local fixer, who was often a journalist from that country, get their sources, get their ideas, get their stories, file a story, win an award, and never even give that local reporter contributing credit. So Round Earth Media is working in a different way that honors a true partnership model. We partner an early career American reporter with an early career reporter from the country where we're working. They work together on a complex, deeply researched, underreported story for binational distribution. So distribution in the United States by the American, and in-country by the in-country reporter. These young teams, and this is an equal partnership, are mentored by our veteran journalists, and their stories are placed the American New York Times, NPR, also more mainstream media like USA Today, similar media outlets in-country. This is real partnership. This is real global journalism. We think a story that's important for Chicagoans to hear is also important for people in Guatemala City to hear, especially if it's happening in Guatemala. And it's, I think, sort of the silver lining to not having the money we used to have to parachute in to do this work. So that's true partnership. That's real global journalism, I think, and supporting the next generation of global correspondents. These are global kids. We've got the best journalists we've ever had, really, I think, to work with. And thanks to MacArthur and others for recognizing, the importance of doing this work.
I think I was on a panel at South by Southwest with, I want to say it's Mark Lacey, who runs the weekend desk at the New York Times, and he said he'd been covering places all over the world, and he'd been a bureau chief in South America or Latin America. He said, I really wanted to get away from when I needed an expert about Honduras to call someone from Harvard who's an expert on Honduras, right?
Hear, hear.
And you just don't think about how often that happens, but read your papers, watch your TV shows, and you start to realize that. So, Raney, when she's talking about this, you see from your vantage point filmmakers, young documentarians coming up in many ways, how facile they are, not just with technology, but how comfortable they are crossing cultures. And that actually really helps some of those stories that you're telling, because they're able to bring something to it that is not the same as if you just plopped someone into a zone.
Right, I mean, I think everything that you're saying, we're seeing reflected in these incredible, especially foreign reporters. We used to call them fixers. We now call them reporters because that's in fact what they do. And we're finding increasingly, especially in the more war zone areas that we really want access to, and we want to get in and actually understand what's happening in Yemen. We want to be in Syria, we want to be in Iraq. We want to be in these countries. We want to be authentically there with people who can actually speak the language. They can actually talk to people who are living the experience. That is increasingly bringing us closer. And again, I was thinking about examples of long sustaining journalism, and what you all are supporting at MacArthur is really going back at these stories again and again and again. So not going to Syria once, but being able to go back and understand our role in it as Americans, the American government's role. So looking at stories from 3 or 4 different angles at all time is really important at Frontline. But we have a whole new cadre of people that we now put on camera. We use their voices. We have them be reporters. And that's really what they always have been for traditional news organizations. We're just calling them what they are. And they're wonderful. And they are absolutely technically nimble and agile and curious. And they love doing things like VR and thinking out of the box for us on story form as well. That's the other thing they bring to our conversation is, how do we tell stories differently? How do we participate with people as we're telling them? They're not shy. They want to talk to people. So it's a new conversation.
Tabitha, how do you cast a wide enough net when you're deciding what to support, what documentaries to fund, to make sure that you're, as she said, oversampling, so to speak, in different communities that might not have had a leg up, might not have gone to the right film school, et cetera, et cetera?
It's always a problem. I mean, to be honest, it is a problem for us, and I suspect many other organizations, about how do we reach the people for who we are not the center of their universe. I mean, at the Sundance, you have the yes, we stand for independent storytelling and freedom of creative expression. We are open to anybody who can tell a story of a certain quality, but how do we make sure we're getting to the people for whom we are not, as I say, the center of their universe? And it's really important, and it's not just, this is not quite answering your question, but it's clearly not just an altruistic act. Mm-hmm. Oh, of course you must help those people who, it's fundamental to the value of our endeavor, because what I believe is that culture is a map of our humanity, and it's the contours of our existence, and it enables us to understand ourselves and our place in the world. And the map must reflect the territory. And if the culture of filmmaking doesn't reflect or accurately describe the world in which we live, what value does it have? And we will all lose our bearings. So it's so important to do that. I don't know what the answer is, apart from us being out there, going to where people are, not relying on just the people we know and the people we know who know some people, but really challenging ourselves to be reaching into different kinds of communities. I don't know what the answer is, though.
So there's, I want to start another round of an idea just about what is the relationship that an audience has or a community has with a journalism institution or a storyteller, and how they trust that person over time, right? So is there institutional brand credibility that automatically, right now, if I say, for example, if I read the New York Times, if I read a piece by Nick Kristof, I trust him. I just feel like he's solid, he's a decent reporter, he's gone all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. When something shows up on a social media feed and perhaps I don't understand where it came from or who actually wrote it, but I see it, what happens to our institutional credibility, and how do we make sure that someone trusts us over time? Jump ball.
We get it right, Harry.
Or you don't do something that you're not then about to do. You don't put a headline on something and then not deliver. So a really humbling experience for Frontline was going onto YouTube. Nobody knew us on YouTube, so we actually had to introduce ourselves to YouTube So that was humbling, but it was really an important moment for us actually to wake up and say, okay, we really are not reaching a whole generation of people on YouTube authentically. So then what we heard from this community was that when we said we were doing something, we actually delivered. We weren't tricking them into looking at something or finding us. And so it was that exercise, what we've always done, but I think taking it to the next level of just trying to be authentic and real and not tricking you. And then over time, they came back, they would comment more, the community's grown, and the same is true on pretty much every platform.
Well, I was going to say, I think that is absolutely true. There are a couple things that we know from the research, from the Youth and Participatory Politics research about young people and this idea of, for example, sharing. Part of the reason, in fact, they're more likely to receive their information or their news from Facebook than they are from their local television station, or is because when it's shared from a friend, there's a kind of question of credibility, right? I'm more likely to not only trust what I'm reading, but to assume that you know my preferences and what I want to read, so I'm more likely to believe and then to engage because the intermediary is someone that I have a relationship with. I think the same can be said for the kind of building of a field, which I know MacArthur is interested in, many of us are, of a civic media field that reflects the kind of identities and identity communities that are important often to young people, right? So when young people come to the Black Youth Project, part of it is they expect a certain type of take and read and analysis that includes the kind of read through the lens of race, because for young people who come to our site, that's an important marker of credibility, right? It's not necessarily the kind of traditional journalism institutions. It is instead a kind of perspective, a cultural, we might say, language that resonates. And so it seems to me there's a whole literature that says, in particular for young people, they don't trust any institutions, right? And maybe rightly so, from Congress to journalism. I think the real kind of innovation now becomes, how do you deliver important information? Because we do want them to be informed citizens in a way that resonates, and they're looking for kind of alternative markers of integrity and connection, and something that says, yes, I'm taking your perspective into consideration when I produce this piece.
I just to say that I think that in our world, in the independent documentary making world, there are different levels of trust. So there's the trust from the character or subject or person that the film is about. Why would they trust this filmmaker to represent their experience and put it up on screen? And then there's the trust of the audience towards independent filmmaking. I mean, the brand line with Sundance probably isn't quite as relevant in this case, but I think one thing that's incredibly important so with the filmmaker and the subject relationship, that trust is earned over usually years of being with those people. And one of the things I think that makes independent documentary so resonant is because it's the painting, not the photograph. The time that goes into it, you have the facts and you have the time, and the combination of those two things creates a kind of meaning that you can't get if you're just in and out. So there's that trust that's built up because of the meaning and because of the time that's spent with the people in the film. The why people should trust documentary, I think, is a question that we should continually ask ourselves, and hope and endeavour through the work of all the people here that we can have a more, not just informed, but media literate population, so that when a film, like the recent controversy around the Vaxxed documentary that was about to air at Tribeca, there were questions, without anyone having seen the film, I must say, but there were questions about whether that was a trustworthy documentary. And I think the more we keep asking ourselves, what am I seeing? Who's telling me the story? Why are they telling me the story? Who's paying for the story? That question is one that should never go away.
There seems to be, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to inform ourselves on what goes into our mouths, but not really through our eyes and in our ears, right? So we can read an ingredient label pretty well at the store and say, well, this is really bad for me, this is junk food, but we don't necessarily have the ability to sort out what's candy and what's broccoli on film or on television very well. I wanted to ask also about, is there now an expectation going forward for storytellers that they need to be engaged in a conversation after the fact, if there was ever an after, right? So technically, I mean that are storytellers expected to be sharing or transparent about their work as they create the work, as the work is published, and afterwards in the sort of comment section? I feel like I have a different relationship with an audience now, and I haven't been in this business that long, but what are the filmmakers and what are the storytellers that you're working with saying about how they, that the last frame of the edit doesn't seem to be the end of the story?
Well, one of the most interesting projects we've worked on is an 8-part series in radio novella, telenovela format in Spanish for Spanish language radio. This was a documentary for National Public Radio, and then a la the Round Earth model, where we also publish or broadcast in country, we did 8 parts. And we told it in a different way because listeners in Latin America are sort of used to that telenovela. This was true, but we left them hanging from point to point. And what really struck us is the conversation that arose around this format in Latin America. In Chiapas this week, there are community conversations after every single one of these air, and they're meeting and learning, and this is reporting on the subject of migration. So people in the US heard this on National Public Radio. They heard about migration. They heard about these kids on the border, all of these issues. But people in Chiapas are able to have a community conversation. Oh, this is what happened to someone when they migrated. Maybe we don't want to migrate. And the conversation with the reporters is different. And this is beautiful when this can happen. I mean, I don't regret it. I don't think it's a problem. The comment section can sometimes get outrageous and crazy, and you just have to disconnect. But look, this is what it's all about. You know, it's about community conversation. It's about reaction. Nobody listens, nobody reads. What are we doing this for, right?
I think that certainly with film as well, that it's certainly never finished until you've shared it with somebody. That the full stop used to be when the lights went down or when the lights came up. Now, certainly in documentary, there is an expectation. There are often hands, often in the Q&A now. It's not what kind of camera did you shoot that on, but it's what should we do? And the filmmaker is expected to have an answer to that. What should we do? Some filmmakers value that, and that's what they want. They've seen something in the world and they've put a frame around it, and they want to carry on that, not just conversation, but they want to catalyze some action. Other filmmakers made the film to express this thing in the world, and you must do with it what you want to do with it. And so I think we as funders must be careful about the pressure that's put on filmmakers to have this huge long tail. But the other thing that I think is becoming increasingly more important, which goes to your point, Mary, is that there is an expectation that after you've made the film, after you've, as it were, taken the pictures, you have a responsibility to take it back to the community that you took it from, whether to continue the conversation, to somehow repay what they've given you. And so I think the conversation in the film world is changing a little as well.
I think for Frontline, we definitely do have the expectation that producers continue to report as well as engage with the audience. So I think that's what's really changed for Frontline is you don't stop reporting on something when your film goes onto the air and online. And so these stories tend to keep going on and again. And they do a big film, but then we ask them to do follow-ups or they come back to it. And then the other thing I think that we've been doing that we're experimenting with is we have a whole engagement team outside of the filmmaker and in collaboration with the filmmaker that's actually asking people what they think. I mean, the simple question that we ask, what did you think? I mean, that doesn't seem that brilliant, but that one question garners more of a conversation than anything that we've ever asked before. That simple question of saying, we actually do want to engage with you, and then we do. and then we have a conversation. And like you said, that sometimes can get out of control, but it's actually rarely does anymore, where we don't feel we can't actually have a really intelligent discourse in real time. So I think some filmmakers are more comfortable with the public conversation than others, and I think it's also important to say that some people want to be more private in their conversations, but to encourage them. And I love the idea of bringing these films into the community, and some of our filmmakers have been actively doing that, like Andres Sedil and others, Daffodil, people from IRP and definitely CIR. Those folks are really taking their film into the community actively, and I want us to learn from that because I think that's important.
Something Tabitha mentioned that is kind of an interesting topic is this: where's the line between your work as a snapshot of what's happening, whether it's for 4 minutes, an hour, versus crossing over into advocacy work, right? So when some hands go up in the audience and say, "What should I do?" What is the role or responsibility of the filmmaker, whether they're acts of journalism or whether they're acts of, so technically speaking, let's say, Raney, to put you on the spot, but 30 years you've been doing The Choice, which is the film we'll see this September between the two candidates from the party. It's one of the greatest hours of Frontline every year, and it will guaranteed, I will bet you money that I don't have, that you will learn something about both of the candidates from watching it. It happens every time. So, but at the end of it, you know, someone's going to say, so who should I vote for? Or did you tell me who I should vote for? Was it buried in the code?
Are you asking me that question, Ari?
But it's, you know, what's...
No, I think the most important thing about Frontline is that this is through and through. So even if we go into the community, is we are not advocates. We're showing you what we've reported. And the job of our producers and reporters is to hold that line. So we're not going to give you an opinion on who you should vote for, but you better believe we're going to be digging. We're going to be looking, and we're going to be exposing what we find when we can actually back it up with facts and reporting. So when you see us come out and say something, it means we believe in what we're saying. So we don't believe in objectivity, we believe in fairness, right? We believe you can have a point of view when it's reported. And we talk about this a lot. You won't see Frontline just tweeting political points of view. You will see us tweet something or go on Facebook or on our website or in a film when we actually have earned it because we've reported it. So we're reporters and journalists first, and we're filmmakers as well. But I think that's the big differentiator when it comes to journalistic documentary. But I do agree also that I think this conversation that's happened out of Tribeca, the importance of truth-telling and funding, are crucial to all forms of storytelling. I just believe in it so much.
Me too. We're not advocates, and I agree with you totally. I do think, because we cover the world outside the US, where a lot of the news is bad news, where, you know, most of the reporting out of Africa, say, is very, very negative. And I think that people are getting tired of opening the newspaper in the morning, especially with foreign reporting, and seeing nothing but really devastating reporting. It's important, it has to be done, it has to be told, but I do think there's a place for, and there's like this new idea of solutions journalism. We can debate that, I'm not convinced, but I do think that we as reporters are obligated as journalists to find solutions if they exist, or at least propose some of that. And at Round Earth Media, we are dedicated to those sorts of stories and may be embarking on an entire project around what may be going right in the world, because some things are, believe it or not, and you wouldn't know that necessarily from reading the paper in the morning.
But before, I think there is also developing, and this is, I think, the beauty of not having one model, right? That, in fact, there is an incredible need for the type of journalism and the journalistic documentaries that you produce, but there's also developing a field we might call kind of civic media that is really fundamentally about advocacy, right? It is about how do I create stories that will mobilize people and get them engaged, right? And the expectation, and often in those cases, is that the story is not under the control of the author, but it is meant to go out into the world and have multiple lives and multiple interpretations, and, you know, be innovated and changed. And so again, it's not an either or, but I do think it's important to understand the kind of the multiplicity of the levels and the complexity of the domain that produces something that we call an informed citizen or an informed person, and this is what democracy looks like now.
So is storytelling getting easier or harder?
I think it's harder. I think it's more creative. I think, especially in the journalism space, I think there's so much more we can do. It's such an exciting time.
Oh, yeah.
We were talking even about VR. It's just at the beginning of so many different types of forms, and I think we're finding that filmmakers are coming through the door now more and more interested in journalism as well. So we're seeing a conversation happen where it's not like, oh, journalism is boring. Like, oh, we can actually claim this. We can tell stories in a way that's, really works for a filmmaker, and it's dramatic. And I think short form is harder than you think. To do well, to do a short story well is one of the hardest things that we've ever had to do. And you know more about this than we do, but cracking that code has been challenging and gratifying.
I think storytelling is such a primal thing. It's not the telling of it that's getting harder. The sustainability around it with, there's some great things happening, like the technology, access to the means of production is much more democratic and much more possible. For big, expensive documentaries where public television and funding generally, there's a downward pressure on that. But there's kind of rising expectation about what these films are going to make in the world, or what these films are going to make happen in the world. That's really tough. I think creatively, there's never been a better time, but I think in terms of sustainability and visibility, there's probably never been a harder time.
In my world, most of the foreign correspondents, Americans especially, are freelancers. They're working without expenses, without regular salaries. Some are going into conflict without health insurance.
Or security.
These are or security, Hari, and we all know this. The technology is fantastic. The people are there to tell the stories. The risks that are being taken are really unacceptable, and some of us, and I know some people in this room have been working with me and others to try to change all of this. And this, for the world I live in, which is the world of outside the U.S., it is really serious, and just want to put that out there. I think a lot of people who consume news don't realize who's reporting your news, and it's being done on the backs of freelancers these days, especially outside the U.S., and that's just got to change.
I keep grabbing.
Thank you.
Yes. That's right. I also think we want to think about the ways in which storytelling has changed and expanded. When I think about, for example, Ferguson, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a foreign location, but in many ways it feels like it. And the ways in which young people took to, I know it's not the same, but their Twitter accounts to tell these incredible stories that actually led the way for professional journalists to then follow suit. So is storytelling more difficult? If at the very least, there are more voices, and we're getting different perspectives in terms of what the news should look like. And I think there are correctives that are happening, often from communities that in the past have been maybe thought to be silent. And so this is, and they're putting themselves in some danger also, of course. So it's again, I keep saying it's an exciting time, right? In terms of the opportunities for people who generally have been shut out from kind of the profession to find alternative ways to have their voices amplified and to mobilize communities that care about their issues and constituencies.
We do have some time for questions, yeah? So there are microphones on either side that if you can go ahead and line up and let us know, who you are and what your question is, and if there's somebody. And then in the meantime, while you're getting there, I just want to ask, so as you point out that technology enables these communities, for example, I think it was after these events this last summer that people started realizing that, well, say for example, what Black Twitter is, right? And the fact that they're not following it, and oh gosh,
their mistake,
right?
Yes.
So that there's basically this group of journalists that I might be following, and then there's all these kids that were talking about something else that's not happening. Anytime you look at number one, what's trending, oftentimes you're like, what the hell is that hashtag?
Right.
I can't even spell that, and then you click on it, and it's a whole nother language. So, yeah.
So I think we're going to start with a question from our Facebook Live.
Oh.
Yeah, we got, excuse me, my name's Cal.
We got a question coming in from Twitter, and if you could say hi really quickly to the people on Facebook Live, they're watching you guys. The question is from Andrea Faye Hart. It is, what are your cultural lenses that inform your delivery?
All right, that's one more question that was better than mine.
That's a good one.
The crowd being inherently smarter than moderators, that's a rule. Anyone?
That question is so smart, I don't actually
It is so
understand
smart. It is so smart.
It's too deep. Can you say that again? Or can you channel Andrew?
It's not mine, so I can't take credit for it. Andrea Faye Hart asked, what are your cultural lenses that inform your delivery? What cultural lenses do you have?
Is she here?
Oh, she is. Wonderful.
There
Thanks.
you are.
You're awesome.
All right, this is
I
very
should have given
meta.
it to you then.
It was so profound, you just wanted it to leave.
Well, we've got tons of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. But I don't have to answer, right? You just said it.
She let you off the
Maybe you
hook.
should interpret that for
no, but
us.
I think if I'm understanding it, I mean, I can articulate what our cultural lens is for the Black Youth Project, right? We're about mobilizing young people, in particular young people of color. It means that we have a certain type of, some people would argue bias, I would say a perspective. I don't do any, let me be very clear, I'm not young, as you probably can tell. I don't control the site. I don't pick the writers. These are all young people who control the site and write for the site. But I think there's a question, and the question often is, there's a kind of idea of objective journalism, and maybe that doesn't exist. So what would be your cultural markers or lenses that guide how you do your work? Is that what you were suggesting? Okay.
When we partner an American under the age of 35 journalist with, let's just say, a Guatemalan under the age of 35 to work on the same story, believe me, they duke it out through their own cultural lenses. And I really do believe that this is a model that gets at the truth as best as I possibly can. And it isn't always easy, but it's really interesting and it is rewarding. And I'm convinced that, you know, the journalism we produce is as good as it is because of that, because we have that kind of cross-cultural partnership and working together to get to the bottom of things. It's tough.
Gentleman over there.
Sure, thank you. My name is Frank Lattin. I'm representing the Westside Media Project. First, I want to say thank you all for having this event. This is great to see all these people out here engaged in media. My comment and question would be, first of all, the fact that I'm here is not lost upon me and this crowd here. So my question is, how do we, as individuals who are interested in expanding the voice in media and MacArthur Foundation, how do we really reach those people who are really outside of the mainstream? For instance, 99% of the people I know on the West Side wouldn't even be close to this venue. They wouldn't even qualify to apply for the funding that's allowed. So the thing is, although there's several groups, and we work with youth and community members providing tools in their hands to tell stories for them to learn media technology, but the thing is, we wouldn't even be able to tell our story because of the fact that, generally speaking, these type of opportunities only go to the usual suspects. Generally speaking, no disrespect to anybody in here. Right. So my thing is, how do we expand that to really get to those people who are outside the mainstream, who are really yearning to be a part of the mainstream? But when we think of West Side, all we think of is crime, violence, drugs, and we need to know these youth before they become a Laquan McDonald and a Mike Brown.
That's right, yeah.
They do great work, but we only know them once a tragedy happens. So if we could speak to really, you know, widening that realm of interest. Thank you.
Sure.
One of the things, and I don't know how to enact it, one of the very important words in our conversation seems to be proximity. And so we at Sundance with our filmmakers, and our filmmakers are the best ambassadors for going into where they may have come from, specific communities that have traditionally been underserved or where they know people. It is them going to where they came from and saying, this is what I've just done, and this is what I did have, this is what I didn't have, and this is how I made the network work. That somehow, that's not to take the responsibility off from us as gatekeepers, as it were, but the proximity thing seems so important, to have an eye-to-eye contact and a proper conversation, and the sense we're not up here on a hill somewhere. We're a group of creative people who started off from all kinds of different places. There is no reason why anybody with the talent and the distinctive voice that we would be looking for, even if they don't have the tools or the resources, there's no reason why they shouldn't be up there with Ryan Coogler and Ava DuVernay, who are very good about going and talking to people face to face. But that sounds naive, but I know it's important.
Can I jump in just real quick? Because, I think the other thing is to understand, and I'm hoping, and I believe MacArthur gets this, is that the field has to be wide, right? Not everyone is going to produce an award-winning documentary. Most of our writers on the Black Youth Project are not going to go on to be professional journalists, right? Many of them are in high school. We're starting a new program where we're taking some high school kids. We're going to teach them things like data analysis, how to write long form and blogs, how to think about Chicago and telling their story rooted in Chicago. It seems to me that if you can have many, many, many of those opportunities, that increasingly your folks from the Westside, and we've worked with CPS kids from the Westside, Southside, will have an opportunity to have voice. And if we begin to tell young people that having voice and mobilizing people and moving people, even if it's 100 people and not 1 million people, is important, it seems to me that that's one way that we expand the opportunities for young people in lots of different spaces to have an opportunity to have voice and also hopefully to have influence.
I also think, just to say, and it's a really important question that you have. It's also really spans across all generations of storytellers, I think, is making sure that we have diverse voices. And one of the things that we've been realizing lately is how many people are now approaching us. So I do feel like breaking down some of these walls in social media, going on new platforms, is enabling people to then come to us and share their stories with us, where they haven't before. We haven't welcomed them in before. So I think actually the first step is saying, we're here, we want to meet you, we want to talk to you, and we're finding that people are starting to come to us more and more, and that's, I think, the first step for us. And then creating other story forms that maybe feel more authentic, frankly, as they may want to go someday, I hope, into investigative journalism, or what their passion is that drives them. So this is the other thing that we're finding, and that's been really encouraging as well. I think we're at the start of this journey.
Can I just say one more thing, because this is it's such an important conversation. But one of the things is for us as the kind of institutions to look for the opportunities. So where are the gaps and where are the opportunities? And VR is one of them. This new technology that really, with respect, no one really knows what they're doing in terms of storytelling. It's all for somebody to make a discovery, and so. Sundance has been getting into it in a kind of strategic way of saying, we need to put these tools, we need to get access to these tools and put them in the hands of people who never normally would be able to or would be offered to it, but they have as much talent and insight and exploratory skills as the rest of us. So let's have a lab and a workshop and get the best people and the best technology and put them into their hands. Because there's no reason why, tech and new technology is a particularly bad area for the underserved, getting any of those chances. So if we can keep looking out for those places that are kind of ground zero for exploration.
So the next great VR documentarian is currently in the 8th grade.
He's in the 8th grade, or she is in the 8th grade,
yes.
playing a video game.
Or they.
Or they. I think it's
Because it's VR has much more in common with gaming than it does with filmmaking, and yet there's an assumption that let's go to the filmmakers, the featured documentary filmmakers to
We
tell
don't game
stories.
nearly enough to get
But
it.
no, I
Yeah.
do think new generations are coming through the door. And the other thing they're doing that I think is crucial and can give you a real benefit is they do things more productively and cheaper. They're hacking into things more natively. They understand how to use technology in a way that really brings a new voice to this type of storytelling. We're working with students more than ever in this space, which Frontline traditionally has never really done, where we're bringing students into the fold, high school students in some cases, college students, where we're saying, let's look at this together because the space is so new and it's not maybe intuitive to someone like me as a linear filmmaker. So we're looking for intuitive storytelling, and oftentimes it is gamers, it's people who've been on Minecraft, it's people who understand this world and this interactive world that you talk about. That world is not the linear world necessarily, so that's where you bring a voice to us that would help together, I think, take this to the next step too.
I mean, we're covering the world, so we're not covering, you know, neighborhoods in Chicago. But I will say that we're working with students, many of whom are first generation college, many of whom are doing area studies. So students from a Muslim background, grew up in the US, speak Arabic, are working with our in-country reporters to report, not in the US, but outside the US. And these are the kinds of folks that we're training. I mean, we want to see to it that there's a diverse next generation of global correspondents. And a lot of them are students now. They're great young journalists. We partner with SIT Study Abroad and run journalism programs around the world. We place student journalism, Americans in partnership with in-country students. Many of those kids are area studies, immigrant kids, and we place their stories under their bylines in the New York Times. This is, you know, this is what I want to see. We've got to have, I mean, you're right, we've got to have these diverse, global, you know, multi-experienced folks producing journalism. It's just, it cannot be white guys who graduated from Yale. And that's what, you know, it just can't.
The NewsHour Student Reporting Labs, if Leah Clapman's here, you can find her. Leah, raise your hand if you're here. I don't know if she's here anymore. But there's about 100 different labs around the country, and they're middle school and high school students, and some of their work actually appears on the NewsHour program and on the site. And it's pretty amazing how good the technical capability of a ninth grader is. And frankly, sometimes they put to shame somebody who's worked a camera for 25, 30 years because they've just grown up natively understanding framing and composition
Absolutely.
in a way because they just had their phones for their whole
Their
lives.
composition is amazing.
Yeah, right. All right. Yeah.
I know. Every
Go
time
ahead.
you're ready to move
That's
on,
right.
I stop you, right?
That's why you're here.
And it is, that's why I'm here to stop you, absolutely. The other thing, though, I think we want to be careful of, and the research that we've done suggests this, is that even though these young people are incredibly digitally connected, right, the language of kind of native can obscure the fact that there are critical skills that they need, and there has to be an infrastructure that is built,
Yeah,
right? Sometimes we just assume that because you're really good and I can give you my phone and you can make it work again, that then you know, then you're able to do everything that's digital. And in fact, what we have to be really conscious of is where do we provide infrastructure for young people who want to do all the things we've just talked about and give them those skills, right? And sometimes I think we jump ahead and assume that they can do that.
Question right there.
Hi, my name's Wade, and I really want to thank you all for a thoughtful, important, engaging conversation. My question is framed as an educator, somebody who used to be in the classroom and now works for an education nonprofit. And this little bit of what I'm asking follows up about what Cathy was just mentioning. I think it's obvious that our youth are savvy in a lot of ways with media, and they definitely are producing a lot of media. But how do we get them to be savvy consumers of media with so many different sources coming at them and make them thoughtful about the choices they are making in the production of media, whether it's local storytelling or whether it's causes they care about? So the questions to any of you, whether it's specific sources that you know or whether it is just broad ideas that you would think about to encourage our youth in their consumption and production of media.
Why don't you
I'll
go with
just
that?
really quickly, right, which is, you know, clearly
part of what we've been doing is working, Jessica Marshall, is that you, Jessica? Right there. So she's in charge of civic education in the Chicago Public Schools. We work with Jessica to think about what type of curricular we might build that kind of promotes media literacy. And in fact, again, the research suggests that about 84% of young people said that they would appreciate help in understanding kind of what are credible sources and what's the kind of quality that they should be thinking about. So again, even though they know how to do certain things, we want to provide them with a kind of level of media literacy, which suggests that we have to find young people where they are, often in schools, and especially around civic education. So we can't be thinking about civic media if we're not also thinking about civic education.
I think PBS in this case actually does a really important job reaching out to high school classrooms and just going into the classrooms with our material. We have this incredible education team that actually works with us at Frontline in all the series to actually create content for younger people where it speaks to them more and it's shorter, and in some cases with Frontline content, it's just too intense for a younger classroom. But I do think that those types of conversations about education are growing, which is great. Even inside our system that's so educationally focused to how do we then take it beyond the classrooms that are already in our world, which is a huge percentage of classrooms, almost 70% of public classrooms. But that doesn't mean that we're reaching everyone. And then taking that educational content and putting it on the platforms they're actually really engaged with is the other big step for us. To think through the education lens instead of the growing audience lens is the big step for Frontline that we're going into the next generation of looking at. It's something I'm really passionate, having children, caring about how do we reach that generation is big.
Okay, just for some geographic diversity over there.
Hi, my name is Marla Gamsey. I'm in the throes of putting together a documentary on Indigenous Australian art, being welcomed onto the homelands in Australia and having access to elders who want to tell stories. You talk all about the youth and digitizing everything and everything about the electronic media. If we have a story to tell on something as mundane or simple as the preservation of this 40,000-year-old culture, and you bring it to the youth, how do you take a story that is beautiful and spiritual, but you've got to tell the children of future generations these stories? How do you turn it into something that they will be engaged in? Because it's just a simple, beautiful story. It's not going to be something that they can relate to, full of digitized graphics from their gaming.
You might be surprised.
Yeah,
I mean,
you'd be
people
surprised.
love beautiful stories at all ages.
Those work.
Right, and we had this one film this year that you would think that about children. We called it Children of Syria, and it simply just followed this one family. It was just their trajectory. There was no other talking. And we got this feedback that was really remarkable about just watching a beautiful story. And of course it was traumatic too, but it had a kind of level of just storytelling that drove a younger audience to us to express, appreciation for that.
I mean, children are closer to those primal stories that we've been telling forever, partly because they're children and we've been telling them stories since they were kids or as they were kids, right? And I think that my personal opinion is just that I think that they appreciate beauty just like the rest of us do, and it doesn't have to be a digital graphic if you allowed them to play with elements of it, right? Whether it's a clip, it's sound, it's music, it's words, it's whatever it is, they're remixing their own stories from whatever assets you provide. And it doesn't have to be, intergalactic, planetary, whatever.
I deeply agree with that.
Me too.
And yet I'm going to throw in just a recent example from Sundance, which was, sorry, I sound like I'm banging the drum for VR, but I'm not. But it's this, there was a project called Collisions, which was made by an Australian artist called Lynette Walworth, with, not just about, but with a man called Nyeri, who is from the Matu people of Western Australia. And his first contact was seeing a nuclear explosion. And so this piece of VR is about him, and it's about him encountering Robert Oppenheimer in a virtual space, and it's about his life through an experiential thing. And because it's VR, that's the other opportunity at the moment, because it's VR, lots of younger people were queuing up to try the VR goggles, and then they were transported virtually to Western Australia, just seeing how art was made and how life was. But the interesting thing about VR was that Nyeri totally got it. He totally got it because these 16 eyes who can see everything at the same time is directly replicable to the kind of art that the Māori people make. So again, it's just a kind of counterexample to it can work, but I agree with you, it doesn't have to. Is the power of the story and the storyteller.
All right, so I hope we've given you a lot to think about this evening, and thank you again for coming out, and thanks to MacArthur for having us, and I hope that all the panels you see have a minority of men on them.